G'day everyone, welcome back to another episode of Ideas Matter podcast. We're back at you with an episode that we didn't have planned. We said at the end of the last episode that we're doing Rousseau's Social Contract. That's still coming next episode.
Hopefully this week.
Yeah, hopefully this week. But we've just decided to do a little bit of a detour because I'm on a Nietzsche reading binge at the moment, and I just finished Genealogy of Morals, and Louis said, look, why don't I just read that and we'll do that for the next episode since you already read it. So that's what we're doing. Today we're doing Nietzsche, Genealogy of Morals.
Yeah, this was my first time reading Nietzsche, which is kind of shameful, really. And you had read a bit of him in uni.
A little bit, yeah.
But recently you you did a subject on him, right, if I remember correctly?
Yeah, I had a 2-week intensive where 1 week was Plato's Republic and the other week was Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Also, he was one of the philosophers in year 12 VC philosophy, which I did. But because, I was in year 12, I didn't really have any brain to understand what he was going on about.
Fair enough. But yeah, and then you recently, you just have smashed out, 3-4 Nietzsche books?
Yeah. So I had my old copy of Beyond Good and Evil from high school, so I reread that and I was like, that was awesome. So then I read The Gay Science, and then I read Genealogy of Morals, and I'm nearly finished with Human All Too Human. He's just great. He's just such a fun, the way that I like to kind of plan out my reading is I always want to do something that's like non-fictional or like philosophy, and then alternate that with something like fiction, like something literary. And when I read Nietzsche, I get like philosophical content with like literary form, just because of like how beautiful of a writer he is, both at the same time. So that's why I've just been smashing through him so much lately.
Yeah. So obviously you like Nietzsche's style. What about his philosophy?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of his philosophy. It's very provocative because so much of what he argues for is against the entire sort of like moral, social, political order that we take for granted today. Like he's a real big critic of Christianity and inherited Christian morals and Christian thought throughout our society. And based on all the things we've been talking about on this pod, that ties in fairly nicely with everything else we've been on about. And I don't know, he just takes, there's one of his books where the subtitle is Philosophizing with a Hammer. So his style is to just go around attacking everything and seeing what stands or what doesn't. For Nietzsche, not much stands. I don't necessarily agree with him on everything, but I do think he's very compelling in the things he argues that are like against modern social mores.
Yeah.
I think I'm at a place where I want to read shit that's like provocative and is completely outside the pale in terms of what people think today. Because that helps me clarify I spent so long just like reading stuff I agree with and like sort of like consuming media I agree with. And it just sort of ended up feeling really boring and unsatisfying to me because like I can read like another, I don't know, like left-wing text and I might learn something new from it, but I already know how that sort of fits into like the broad contours of this worldview that I already held. So when I read things that aren't of that milieu, then that helps me one, it challenges me and I actually have changed my views quite a bit. And two, it helps me clarify the ideas I already had because I'm putting them in opposition to something, not just, feeding on from the same sort of ideas. You get what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel much the same way. And I also feel the same way about reading more primary texts, which was why it was difficult for me to read Nietzsche, but to quote, was it Mark Fisher? Like the difficulty of Nietzsche is the point. That is Nietzsche, not to get off put by how hard some of these texts are and to just slog through and come away with, as much as you can get. He has this, like you said, he philosophizes with a hammer. He has this real sort of acerbic, scathing prose where he just, a lot of it is attacking. But then out of that, you get these moments of great insight and really novel ideas which get picked up on by later philosophers. I mean, as we'll see in this pod, Freud, There's a lot in, like, sometimes people call him a proto-existentialist.
Also, there's a bit of Foucault that I see in here and a bit of Heidegger too.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know much about Foucault, but yeah, that makes sense. There was also something in here where he's like riffing on Kant, and he says something that like reminded me of Berkeley, which it sounds out of left field, but like that was interesting. There's like lots of novel ideas in here, but I guess everyone sort of knows the name Nietzsche, but perhaps we should like contextualize him a little bit. Like he's German, right?
Yeah. So he was a German thinker from the second half of the 1800s. He was the son of a Lutheran priest, and I believe up until he was about 20 years old, he wanted to become a priest, but then he had a break with Christianity and went on to study philology. And philology is sort of like the old school version of linguistics, but it's sort of like a mix of linguistics and like a classical scholar, a bit of historian, a bit of history of ideas going on there in the work of a philologist. It's not just purely on the technical aspects of language, although that's included too. And he ended up becoming a professor of philology at the University of Basel at age, I think it was like 24. So
yeah, it was unheard of.
Yeah.
I remember from reading the introduction to this book, it was very young to be a professor, and everyone sort of expected great things from him, because he showed great promise, throughout high school and university, and then his PhD thesis was very highly regarded. So people thought he was going to be this phenomenal scholar in this field, and people were sort of let down, I think, by his scholarly career, and he was sort of let down by that. And so after that, he turned towards writing these books that we have today.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, people didn't really take notice.
Yeah. He's a real iconoclast. Like, he's provocative, and I think his provocations, I don't think they're affected in the sense that he's just trying to get a rise out of people, though I think he likes doing that. I think he does think this stuff too, but it's easy to see why he wasn't all too successful, at least early on in his lifetime, because of the ideas he was putting forth. This was still Europe in the 1800s, where he argues about the disillusion of Christianity and as a social force, as kind of like its sense of metaphysical meaning in the West, but Christian morals still held around, and he was dead against Christian morals in his arguments. Also, he did start getting quite a bit of success towards the end of his life, but just before we get to that, he suffered from ill health through his life. So after he was at the university very briefly, and he retired because of his ill health, and he's just spent sort of the rest of his life traveling around the Mediterranean parts of Europe and Switzerland, just going where the weather was good, getting the nice air and writing. And then at around, I forgot the year, but it's in the late 1880s, he had a complete mental collapse. The prevailing view is this was because of syphilis. He got syphilis, and back then they'd had no treatment for it, and eventually syphilis will spread to your brain. I've heard as well that it could have been an undiagnosed brain tumor, or maybe just like psychologically he had some stuff going on and he had a collapse based on that. But whatever happened, he had this massive mental collapse, which also was a physical collapse. So he spent the last 10 years of his life in this period of sort of insanity and ill health, and then died. And it was in that sort of last period, actually, that he started to get quite a bit of success, at least among like the literary classes of Europe. Like, if you read, I read this, I read James Joyce's Dubliners, his first short story collection, a couple months ago, and it was written about, I'd say, guessing off the top of my head, like 1910s, and he mentions a character having read Nietzsche's books in that, being written in that time. So his ideas were floating around in these sort of literary classes, but I don't think that he at all had the popularity he'd have today.
Yeah, and then sort of, a little bit later on after that, people began to associate him with Nazism. And so in the Anglo-American world, he was not taken seriously. for quite a long time until, was it Walter Kaufmann published a book arguing against that interpretation, how that wasn't actually, that was a gross misrepresentation of Nietzsche, that he was a Nazi. But the intro to the version of the book I have was quite interesting. I read it, and they were talking about like where that misrepresentation comes from, particularly this idea that, Nietzsche talks about the overman and how that was sort of misconstrued by the Nazis as being like the Aryan race, where that's not what Nietzsche meant at all. But this misrepresentation really comes from his sister.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it sort of sounds like a bit of a trope to blame it on your sister, but like it sounds very true, because she was married to, well, this was before the Nazi Party, but she was married to like a very, very racist German who actually her husband tried to set up an Aryan colony in South America, and she briefly moved there. So she was very much like, she was a believer in this sort of like German master race stuff, and she after Nietzsche became ill and after he died, she got the rights to all his works, right? And she would publish not the entire thing, but she would publish like selected bits, and she would encourage Nazis. Like, she knew high-ranking Nazis a little bit later on, and she would tell them that like, no, Nietzsche is what you're talking about. Like, you can find philosophical grounding for your ideas in Nietzsche. So she actively encouraged this interpretation of her brother's work, but she herself was not a philosopher, not philosophically trained, obviously was predisposed to want to find this sort of justification in Nietzsche's work. So it's unfortunate for such a long time he was interpreted in that way. And even to this day, you still sort of find him being, I guess, well, maybe, I don't know, slightly more popular on the right.
Yeah.
Regarded as like maybe not a right-wing philosopher, but sort of gels a little bit more easily with some right-wing views. But also a lot of left-wing people like him as well. But that's just a sort of a historical misrepresentation, that if you have any apprehensions about that, he's not a Nazi, don't worry.
Yeah, he actually, in this book and in some of his other books, he just bags the hell out of anti-Semites.
Yeah.
Like, he hated anti-Semites. And I feel like that alone kind of deads the idea that he was a proto-Nazi, because, well, why would he as a Nazi hate anti-Semites?
Yeah, I don't think he was too fond of nationalism either.
Yeah, not at all.
He became very disillusioned with Wagner, which he says in his book, for becoming a nationalist.
Mm. And also on the thing of Nietzsche's influence on the right, and also him getting picked up as well by a lot of people on the left, when I had that intensive subject on Thus Spoke Zarathustra, one of his other works, the teacher that I had for that subject said, you can see existentialism as an attempt to make Nietzsche's ideas left-wing.
That's interesting.
Because Nietzsche he is sort of like proto-existentialist in the sense that he has a lot of those same ideas about, like forging one's own will in a world that doesn't have inherent meaning. But he's also very anti-egalitarian and like aristocratic. He has no shame in saying, but not everybody has the capacity to do this. It's only a small minority, and the mass of people just kind of have to deal with their shit life. Whereas the existentialist thing is, how can we do that for everyone?
Yeah, for sure. Was that Daniel Lopez who said that?
It was Daniel Lopez.
Yeah, he follows Ideas Matter on Twitter. So,
Does he?
So if you're listening,
shout out Daniel Lopez. He was actually a fantastic teacher.
Well, there you go.
Yeah,
there you go. Left-wing guy, clearly. But yeah, also interested in Nietzsche. Which it's an interesting crossover. But okay, well, we should get into his ideas.
Yeah.
So the point of this book, I mean, it's kind of given away in the title. On the Genealogy of Morality is my translation. Yours is On the Genealogy of Morals.
Yeah. So what are we talking about when we talk about a genealogy?
Yeah, well, we're talking about a history. We're talking about where things come from, what their roots are, what their ancestry is.
Yeah.
So the point of this book is he wants to interrogate A, where morality has come from, and B, he wants to do something that an analytic philosopher would call meta-ethics. So he says, why do we ascribe the values that we do to the values that we hold? So when we say something is good, why do we think that thing is good? Where does that value judgment come from, historically speaking? So that's the main purpose of the book, hence the title, On the Genealogy of Morality.
Right. And also, this is he gets into this in the first two essays, not so much this third essay of the book. By the way, this book is split into 3 essays. We'll be going through them sort of chronologically, but they all build on one another. And as you need to keep in mind, his training is a philologist, so he looks at language and the development of language, and he uses his what you might call a mouthful here, philological method, or maybe like linguistic method here, to analyze these ideas. So he looks at the history of a word, he looks at the genealogy of a word to reveal something about moral concepts. And I thought it's a very interesting way to go about things. What did you think about that method?
I thought it was interesting. I think it can be really useful. I particularly, I mean, there was a good point in the introduction where it talks about how Nietzsche's approach, one of the things he's trying to show is that, I mean, if you look at what analytic philosophy does, and they're like, what is justice? What is free will? And then they give you all these case studies, and they go, well, here's free will, here's not free will, here is free will. What do all these cases have in common? Bingo, we've found our underlying core of the concept, right? That sort of method. Nietzsche, being sort of more historically minded, which I like, he's kind of skeptical about that. And he says a few times that like we just can't define a concept like that. The reason being is because he says in one point of time, this word might have meant something, and then 100 years later, it comes to mean something else, but it also sort of retains the previous definition. So, 1,000 years later, we have all these competing meanings of a word tied up with it, and it's impossible, to isolate its core meaning. And there's a beautiful analogy in the introduction where the author says, we can think about this as like, instead of a concept being like a metal rod with a core running through it that ties the whole thing together, think of it like a string. And a string or a rope is actually a bunch of other strings tied together, and then you get the whole. But if you begin to unpull it, there's no core. It's just different things interwoven together.
That's a fantastic analogy for his whole method.
Yeah. I'm like, wow, okay, great.
That's really good. Wow.
This is why I never used to do this, but if you have a classic text, dude, read the introduction, because they're written by philosophers who know what they're talking about, and you get like great insights like that, which help you understand the text. So that was great. Shout out to Maud Marie Clark, maybe butchering their first name, but fantastic analogy. And that's kind of what he's trying to get at, is like the meanings that we attach to things are very historically caught up. And there is no unchanging eternal essence to these ideas of good, bad, what have you. They come out of historical contexts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he has this line, I don't know if it's in this book or another one, but he says the congenital defect of all philosophers is that they're not sufficiently historical.
Oh, couldn't agree more. Yeah.
And so let's get into this first essay, but right before we do that, I just want to bring out a quote from Beyond Good and Evil. So this book on the genealogy of morals came out a year after Beyond Good and Evil, and it really fleshes out a lot of the ideas in that. But some of you might know Nietzsche writes in aphorisms, so not like fully laid out arguments in like an essay or a book format that you might traditionally expect from philosophy. He might just put out a little paragraph, or maybe just one or two lines, or an aphorism could go for a couple pages. But just something short and sweet that it tries to encapsulate the idea he's going for, rather than like a full argument. And this is an attempt to expand some of those ideas that he had in Beyond Good and Evil. And one of the ideas one of the aphorisms in Beyond Good and Evil that I feel really encapsulates a lot of his thought and encapsulates a lot of the things that he addresses in this book here is, there are no moral phenomena, only moral interpretations of phenomena. So keep that in mind as we're going through this.
Interesting. Yeah. So I guess one of the like most obvious misinterpretations is to think that Nietzsche is against morality. But we have to distinguish between two senses of morality here. He's against capital M. He's against our system of morality. Mm-hmm. So when he says he's against morality and he's an immoralist, he's against morality as it exists, as our system, right? Because he thinks it's come out of this. It has these roots which are problematic, and we need to transcend it, or move beyond it, rather. He's not advocating that you be an asshole. So the edited intro breaks this down quite nicely. Is like what he means when he's against morality is probably what we today would call ethics, right? So he's in favor of ethics. Like we need some sort of ethical system, but the particular kind of ethics, like one's individual morality, he would be against. He doesn't like it as it currently sits. But he's not saying that we should just go around killing each other. Of course not. So distinguishing between the broader case morality and then the smaller case morality as it currently exists, that's what he's against. And you understand why he's against it, because in the first treatise, he's like, well, where does this come from? Philologically or etymologically speaking. Historically, he argues, and I can't attest for whether this is true or not, but he says that, like, historically, the word good didn't have a moral connotation, but rather it was associated with, like, what was superior or higher in a society. So basically, like, that which is good was associated with the upper class, the aristocracy. Things that they did, how they acted, they had the power to, refer to those things as good and virtuous. And so you get this kind of like maybe aristocratic virtues or an honor society, things like that, right? The morality is like what the aristocracy does. And then he says over time, what gradually happened was like the people who weren't part of that class, they began to think about morality in what's good is unegoistic acts, which is what we think today, right? We think being moral is sort of being selfless and thinking about others, and the goodness of an act is judged by how those who are on the receiving end of it feel about it, right? This, to Nietzsche, is an historical development, and he calls it a slave morality because it was the people who weren't at the top of society. They argued, not literally, but like they sort of pushed this view that morality is actually being unegoistic and it's treating others as you would like to be treated. And he says, well, this happened because it was the people on the bottom of society who were sort of reacting against this aristocratic virtue, which they were hard done by. And he calls this a slave morality. And he gives an example of Christianity. He says Christianity is a slave morality because it encourages us to, be kind and to be sort of self-effacing, really sort of the opposite of these like aristocratic virtues.
Yeah, like in his sort of conception here of what he goes from good and bad to good and evil. So going back to that idea of like the aristocratic morality, keep in mind he's a philologist and his specialty areas were Latin and Greek. So he knew a lot about the ancient Rome and a lot about ancient Greek. And he really looked up to the era of like pre-Socratic Greece, like the Homeric heroes and whatnot. And looking at the sort of values that they had, it was like to be good in that society was to be strong, it's to be powerful, it's to have, it's to follow your instincts, it's to have the freedom and the ability to act upon the world in any way you want to. And to be bad was simply to not be the kind of person who can do that. So to be a slave, to be a peasant or whatnot. And this sort of, like you said, it traces back in the etymology of words. So in the different Proto-Indo-European languages, big word there, but all of the languages across Europe, in Iran and North India, all derive from a common source. So in the same way that species evolve, so too do languages. And all of those languages from North India, from Iran, from Europe, go from the same source of Proto-Indo-European. That's just the name that scholars put on it. Used to be called Aryan, but then that kind of got a bad connotation because the Nazis wanted that.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, the word Aryan figures into his argument because Arya is the ancient Sanskrit, the old North Indian language is sort of like the North Indian version of Latin, the old Sanskrit word for glory. And this glory had a denotation of being something that's good, something that's great, but also of power, of an upper class. So these ideas of these words that we use to describe things that are moral concepts also coincide with things that have to do with strength and with nobility and whatnot. So and then the words related to bad or things or people that were bad sort of related to ideas of people being vulgar, of people being dirty, of plain, of simple. So you can see that this power dynamic socially makes itself known through the language used here. And this sort of social difference in power dynamics was just the moral system too. If you're on top, you're good. If you're on bottom, you're bad. Then there's what he calls, this is a big idea for Nietzsche, the reversion of values. So that's what you were getting at with the idea of slave morality. They're making a virtue out of the necessity of the behaviors, of the opinions, of the constitution that they have to have given their position in society. So these people in the lower class of society have reversed the aristocratic values. So why did they do that? Well, because they have no power to actually act out their resentment of the people over them. You know, if you're a slave and if you're a peasant maybe, or you're a slave and you're being lorded over by people who have, you know, expensive armor and they have horses and they have nice swords and shields, there's not much you can do. You can't physically change that power dynamic, and if you try to do it, you're going to get killed. So if you can't change the sort of physical power dynamic at work there, then, and like you said, Nietzsche doesn't think that they did this in any intentional sense, but just as a sort of like psychological, like as a mental response to being in this sort of situation, they began to see themselves as being morally superior. And the sorts of things the sorts of behaviors and dispositions that they had to adopt to survive in that position, they began to see as good. And they define this against not a bad, but an evil. So Nietzsche says that in this morality, they define themselves against an evil. To be good was to be not of this evil, which was to be someone who exercises strength wantonly, who is greedy, who is lustful and whatnot. Well, why are those things bad? Well, if you're a slave, you can't do those things, but if you're an upper class aristocrat, you can do those things because you have the power to do so. So slave morality is a reversion of values. It's a reversion of the values of the aristocratic class.
Yeah, I think an interesting way to sort of illustrate this and also illustrate the historicism that's explicit in all of this is like, why is someone like Alexander the Great called Alexander the Great? Like, you know, he conquered, he invaded, raped, pillaged. Similarly, you know, look at all the TV shows today about Vikings. And they open with scenes of like them basically just like plundering and doing all these heinous acts.
Heinous to us.
Heinous to us, right? It would just be a category error for us to be like, that's immoral. Right? No, like at the time that wasn't immoral per se. I mean, that was just like, as you said, like it's these people wantonly exercising their power and strength and taking what they want, right? Whereas the people who suffer from that, like over time, they begin to develop this morality that like looks down on that because they don't have the power to do that. So they begin to view themselves as morally superior. I mean, and he pins a lot of this on Christianity and also on the Jews, which, you know, makes the sort of Nazi interpretation plausible for a second, but there's a lot of nuance there. It says, look, historically, like this is where it comes from, and like we just stick on like the conquering example. In Christianity, you get like theories of just war. It's like why would you have a theory of like when it is and isn't justifiable to invade? It would make no sense to a lot of these like ancient cultures. It's just power, right? But over time, you get this sort of inversion, and you get these people become trapped by these slave morality, and he views a lot of this as like the growing power of the church in Europe over time, like begins to like sort of pull these rulers into their sort of slave morality.
Right. And I just want to read out a little section here. I want to read out a couple things from the book as we go through this episode because, well, it's one thing to talk about Nietzsche's ideas, but he's just such an amazing writer that I feel like we're missing a bit of the flavor if we don't go through it ourselves and read it for you guys. So I just want to read this part that encapsulates what you said there. Quote, "It was the Jews who, in opposition to the aristocratic equation, good equals aristocratic equals beautiful equals happy equals loved by the gods, ventured with an awesome consistency to suggest the contrary equation, and indeed to hold fast with the teeth of the most profound hatred, the hatred born of weakness, to this contrary equation, namely, the wretched are alone the good, The poor, the weak, the lowly are alone the good. The suffering, the needy, the sick, the loathsome are the only ones who are pious, the only ones who are blessed. Salvation is for them alone. But you, on the other hand, you aristocrats, you men of power, you are for all eternity the evil, the horrible, the covetous, the insatiate, the godless. Eternally also shall you be the wretched, the cursed, the damned. We know who it was who reaped the heritage of this Jewish reversal of values. And again, keep in mind that it's easy to read the whole Jewish thing. It's easy to read Nazism back into it. But it's just as sort of like the historical lineage of that idea. Christianity developed out of Judaism, and Judaism developed in a context of being dominated by different empires, Babylon, Egypt, Rome. So he's not saying the Jews are bad and they're shit and we should get rid of them. He's saying, no, this idea arose out of the Jews for a reason and just happened to spread. But also I feel like that really encapsulates that idea of what slave morality entails.
Yeah. With the Jews, the slave revolt morality begins. That revolt has a 2,000-year history behind it, and which has only moved out of our sight today because it has been victorious. So Nietzsche says that like the feeling or the emotion or the affect, rather, that's driving this sort of slave revolt is resentment. Now, he's using a French word here, and I'm not going to try and pronounce it. I'm just going to call it resentment. But he says the slave revolt immorality begins when resentment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values. The resentment of beings denied the true reaction, that of the deed, who recover their losses only through an imaginary revenge. Whereas all noble morality grows out of a triumphant yes saying to oneself. From the outset, slave morality says no to an outside, to a different, to a not self, and this no is its creative deed. So the idea is here, whereas the aristocrats have all this power in society so they can go around doing what they want, it's a very it's a positive in the sense of like they're doing, right? And in so doing, they create values. Like, you know, they invade, they plunder, they conquest. Oh, isn't that glorious, right? And they construct all these aristocratic virtues around it. Because the slave can't do that, right? They're denied the true reaction, that of the deed. They can only create values in a negative way by saying no, like that's wrong, you can't do that, and he calls it an imaginary revenge. So it's sort of taking part internally. It's this sort of development of a morality which is denying these aristocratic values. It's against them in a certain sense.
Yeah, and that element of resentment is really central to this idea, and also a lot of the ideas throughout the rest of the genealogy of morals. And it's really striking to get this idea of, you know, the centrality of resentment to this sort of morality. And you have a look around at a lot of political discourse today and see how much of it is really driven by resentment. Like, no, you're shit because oh no, this person's evil, this person's so bad because of this. And what is it that they do? They're exercising their own power and you don't like it. Why?
Well, yeah, to give a really sort of like trivial and like, you know, mundane example, it's kind of like, you know, people who spend their whole life like wishing they could do something, right? And then they see someone who actually does it and they go, oh, look at that person. Like, and they're so lame, you know, they just sort of make fun of them. But it's like, really, like what's actually motivating that is like, well, you wish you were doing that.
Yeah, Fox and the Grapes.
Yeah, I mean, that's a sort of a, you know, a very like everyday example, but I feel like it illustrates the point. Like that's sort of, it's this resentment against those who actually go out there and act and like create their own values. People resent that.
Mm-hmm. And in the terms of like creating your own values, that's a big thing for Nietzsche. And he, like you said earlier, he kind of conceives this as the difference between life-affirming and life-denying ways of, you know, thinking and acting in the world. He's big into affirmations. He runs an affirmation Instagram page. Daily Affirmations.
Daily Affirmations by Friedrich Nietzsche. I wish he was alive today doing that. Yeah, but I guess that's a good point, this like life-affirming versus life-denying, because there is an analogy that, you know, that runs through Nietzsche and is sort of popular at the time, and you see it in sort of other philosophers, is like, you actually see it quite a lot in Kant, and Nietzsche references Kant all the time. Remember in the podcast we did on Kant's theory of history, he talks about humanity as an organism. And what do organisms do? They strive to fulfill all their potential, and they grow, and they take up as much space as they can. They have, to what Nietzsche would say, a will to power, right? So they naturally want to exercise power, and they want to grow. It's sort of the natural impulse that we have. And the problem that Nietzsche sees with this sort of slave morality is not so much that it's making you be nice, right? He doesn't have a problem with that. The problem is that it is, as you say, it's life denying. It's a negative morality. It's stopping the human organism, the human spirit, from exercising its will to power. It's denying us certain things. That's the problem that he identifies with it.
Yeah, and yeah, it's these ideas, so to speak, they clip the wings of human potential.
Yeah.
Nietzsche's highest sort of goal is the full exercise of human potential, and he contends that not everybody can fully exercise human potential. Rather, can't be fully exercised if everybody is held to an equal playing field. There has to be some sort of inequality. Some people who can't exercise their potential just to allow the sort of ability of others to do so. And he's completely okay with that. Like he's straightforwardly aristocratic in this sense. There should be a set of people who aren't able to do this, so a small set of people can do this. Because what's important isn't that everyone is able to do it. What's important is that this gets its fullest expression in marvelous individuals. There's a passage here where he sort of talks about the good as it's conceived in these different moralities. It's not surprising that the lambs should bear ill will against the great birds of prey, but that's no reason for blaming the great birds of prey for taking the little lambs. And when the lambs say among themselves, those birds of prey are evil, and he who is most unlike a bird of prey, who is most like its opposite, a lamb, is he not good? Then there is nothing to cavil about in the setting up of this ideal, except perhaps that the birds of prey will regard it with some measure of derision, and say to themselves, we bear no ill will against these fine goodly lambs, we even like them. Nothing is tastier than a tender lamb. To demand of strength that it should not express itself as strength, that it should not be a wish to overpower, a wish to conquer, a wish to become master, a lust for enemies, resistance and triumphs, is just as absurd as to require of weakness that it should express itself as strength. A measure of force is just such a measure of impetus, will, action. Rather, it is nothing but those very phenomena of impelling, willing, acting, and it can appear otherwise only under the sway of language, which understands wrongly all action as dependent upon an agent, a subject. And this is sort of towards the end, but he develops this into this interesting idea that, well, there is something that develops out of slave morality, because he says this original conception of the good, the aristocrat, the warrior who can exercise himself freely. I'm going to keep quoting because he says it a lot better than I can. There is no such substratum. There is no being behind the action, the effect, the becoming. The agent is a mere accessory to the action. The action is everything. So to these sort of original good, these warriors, they're, like he says, they're birds of prey. They operate by instinct, the fullest expression of their instincts. And what happens with the people who can't do that? They gain a sense of inwardness. He develops this in the second essay, but they gain a sense of inwardness that introduces this idea, this concept that it's, so profoundly interwoven with our Western ideas of philosophy, that of the subject, the thing behind the person who acts.
The thing behind the person who acts, yeah. That's fascinating. I want to come back to that because as you were talking, I was thinking, number one, again, picking up on the Kant analogy, you remember from the previous podcast, Kant thought that, what's the thing spurring human history? It's our social unsociability or unsocial sociability, whatever. You got people interacting with one another, and we want to be better than one another, but we also want recognition from one another. And in this sort of tension, we're like pushed to like create and be better. So Nietzsche sort of, I guess, picks up on that, but goes a bit further because we want to dominate one another. And to get that greatest, fullest expression, to win, someone has to lose, to put it trivially.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's kind of the idea here. And look, I'm going to be very true to form and like give an example from Australian politics. Like look at someone like Paul Keating, right? Like Paul Keating. I mean, look, I see this even today, like this sort of discourse that's like, oh my God, politics is so mean, right? And they're trying to sort of apply this morality of everyday life to a sphere of politics, which to me doesn't make any sense. You look at just how brutal Paul Keating was to like his opponents. I mean, for people who aren't Australian, Paul Keating was the leader of the Labor Party, treasurer and then prime minister in the 90s. And he's known for being like very scathing and very witty and just like putting down his opponents. And during the 1993 election, like everyone thought he was going to lose. And he was really, really mean to John Hewson, the leader of the Liberal Party. And I remember reading about this and something that struck me. Apparently after he won, he went up to John Hewson and he was like very sincere in his apology. And he was like, look, Hewson, like, I apologize for being so mean to you, but I wanted to win. And it's like, you're not going to, in life, to hit your full potential, to actually succeed and to carry out these deeds and to exercise your will to power. What Nietzsche would see as really, really harmful to humanity would be for someone like Paul Keating or anyone, any person who's exercising their power over others, to stop and be like, oh, well, maybe I should not do that because that might make them feel a little bit bad about themselves. And that he says in the start, he's against this softening of human feelings. We're really averse now in modern society to that sort of behaviour. And I agree with him. I think that's potentially harmful to us reaching our potential.
That's a fantastic example. Yeah, that's a really great way to put it. Because when he brings up these ideas of sort of like the powerful, willing person, it's easy to think of like, oh, this is a thing that was in ancient Greece and whatnot, because those are the examples he uses. But that's, like Paul Keating did it. You can look at anyone who's powerful or political figure today and they do this sort of thing. And he also attributes this to artists. Like to him, the ideal artist or the ideal thinker is also someone who exercises their power upon the world. This is a thing that I've thought about ever since I did this intensive subject on Nietzsche. But Kanye West sort of feels like me to a Nietzschean sort of character.
Yeah, okay, I bring up Paul Keating, you bring up Kanye West.
The duality of man. The artist is a really big thing for Nietzsche, though, and I feel like Kanye is a really good example of that, in that he just has exerted his will upon the artistic world in such a way that he made it molded in his character. I mean, every time he dropped an album for like, let's just say like every other album he drops throughout his career, it was like real iconoclastic. It was provocative. It was completely apart from the sound of the time, but it changed the world of music around him to sort of match his form. He exerted his will upon the world in an artistic sense.
Yeah, I mean, look, this actually is a great way of going back to what you said before about how for, the person who's exercising their will to power, it's all about the action, right? But then for the slaves who can't do this, it becomes about the person behind the action.
Right.
Right? And so he sort of talks about this a little bit later on in relation to art, where he's like, art, you don't want to pay too much attention to the artist. It's actually about the art. The artist is just merely where this stuff grows from, right? But actually it's the act of creating and the creation itself that has all this meaning. Whereas, today you get this kind of like slave morality. Like, well, I've always found it kind of sus when people are like, oh, you can't enjoy that person's art because, like, as it turns out, like, they were a bad person. Like, I don't know, like, I'll give an example, like Kevin Spacey, right? Kevin Spacey, as it turns out, bad dude, right? Did some pretty ethically sus stuff. But American Beauty, I think, is one of the most fantastic films of all time. It's my favorite film. It's just phenomenal. But there's this sort of sense in which, like, okay, you can't go back now and enjoy Kevin Spacey's performance because he's tainted ethically, right? We look at the person behind the act. But no, the performance is its own, the action is its own thing. And you want to look at the performance and judge it as its own entity. But this sort of slave morality is like, oh no, but that person, like they're a bad person, so you can't appreciate this beautiful thing they created. I think that might be an illustration of what he's trying to get at here.
Yeah, that's actually a fantastic point to bring up. Is I forget if he brings it up in here or in another one. Maybe he doesn't bring it up at all. Maybe this is just something I've put together in my head from his own ideas. I don't actually know. If someone's read it, please let me know if this is in fact directly from him or just informed by him. But I feel like there's this idea in Nietzsche that like the person who exercises their will to power to their fullest extent, and this includes the artist as well, shouldn't be expected to be someone who falls in line with the morality of the day. Like precisely because they're fully expending their will to power upon the world, they're going to act in ways that aren't moral, so to speak.
And I think it's useful here to say, like, Nietzsche's not excusing. Like, if it were the case that an artist did do things that were heinous, he's not saying, oh, well, that's just the price you pay for, like, you know, this great art. But it's just a mistake of analysis. It's just like a misapplying the concept to be like, well, that's immoral.
Yeah. And like I hear so much. I love Kanye West, but if you couldn't tell by the fact that I brought in the example,
Kanye West is a better example than like someone who touches kids, because Kanye West, to my knowledge, has not done that.
No,
but he's an asshole.
Yeah, that's the thing you hear about Kanye from people. He's like, oh, he's so arrogant. He's such an asshole. It's like, he is, but he wouldn't be great if he wasn't.
Okay, another good example in the similar vein is Conor McGregor, UFC fighter.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's a great one.
Like I cannot stand him as a person.
He's a dickhead. Yeah,
he's vain. He's a dickhead. But he is a phenomenal martial artist.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, he wouldn't be Conor McGregor if he didn't have his skill as a martial artist. Probably is coming from the same place that makes him an asshole, right? It's that will to power. It's that domination, right? That's another example. Better example than a fucking pedophile. I'm sorry.
But yeah, like if Conor McGregor was actually like, I've changed myself. I'm a nice guy now. Like,
probably lose the next UFC fight he had.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, like he's not such. He's been losing a bit lately, but let's think like back in his like prime era of Conor McGregor. You know, was in the middle of his championship run, and then he just goes, "I want to be a nice guy now. I'm actually not driven by this will to become the best person ever to do this thing. I just want to relax but I'll still do my fights." Like,
yeah,
dude, he's not going to win those fights.
No.
Precisely what makes him great is that same thing that people don't like him for. It's that arrogance, that idea that, yeah, I am the fucking best and I'm going to show everyone that I am the best.
But through that, you get these fantastic performances of martial arts, and you also get crazy things. Like, remember when he fought Floyd Mayweather?
Yes.
Like, who is going to be so arrogant as to want to take on one of the best technical boxers of all time? Like, only Conor McGregor. Right, and we might recoil from that arrogance and be like, oh, well, this is a bad person, and behind that is we might want to psychopathologize him, all of which might be true. But the point is that, like, as a result, we get this fantastic flourishing of human potential. And Nietzsche is concerned that in the softening of our morality, we might be throwing out that great flourishing.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, to put that on. Should we move on to the second essay then? Because I feel like that's great point to finish that. So with the first essay he's talking about, or in my translation it's essays, in yours it's treatise. The first essay he's talking about good and evil and good and bad. In the second essay he moves to the ideas of guilt and bad conscience. So where does guilt and bad conscience come from? Where do these sort of arise from? And he traces this sort of thing historically as well. Like, well, bad conscience and guilt depends on the idea of conscience in a general sense, not consciousness, but conscience in the sense of like being having like this internal moral character that speaks to you and is sort of guiding your thoughts and actions in a moral sense. And in a Kantian way, in a sort of like state of nature way. Or he's not really so much a state of nature thinker, but putting this sort of into like a first principle, is that we get the idea of conscience from the idea of responsibility. Like as a person that interacts with other people, you are going to have certain duties and obligations to them just to survive. And in order that you might actually have the ability to, ensure you're fulfilling these obligations and duties to other people, you need something in you that's keeping that going and keeping you in check just in case you want to do something else. So that's where conscience arises from. It arises from responsibility.
Yeah, this to me was the most fascinating treatise or essay, because a lot of it is really anticipating Freud. And Freud read Nietzsche, and you see that in this treatise because he's talking about the creation of guilty conscience and the repressing of our will to power. And when we repress it, it doesn't go away. It gets turned inward. So it's quite to be specific. He says that this like guilty conscience, this internal voice that we have telling us we've done something right or wrong, comes historically out of debt, right? So we imagine in like a very early society in which, I don't know, I borrow something from you, or like you do something for me and I have to repay you. If I don't repay you, what are you going to do in this early society? You're going to exact vengeance on me. You're going to, I don't know, kill me, or you can look at really extreme examples and like...
have a look at the old Code of Hammurabi. One of the first sort of law, I think the first law document that we actually have in human history, and it's where the idea of an eye for an eye comes from. If you owe someone something or you do some sort of damage to someone else's property, you can exact your compensation from them in their own sort of flesh and blood.
Yeah.
If you steal or you owe this much worth of wheat or this many sheep or whatnot, I can take your eye out.
Yeah. And you can find even more extreme examples. I don't want to like mistakenly name a tribe, but like in certain tribal societies, like if someone kills someone else, right, the family that's had someone killed, not only is it okay for them to go and kill the person who killed their brother, but if they can't kill that person, then they can kill other male members of that family.
Yeah, there's like the idea of the blood feud. This is still a thing that happens in like the Balkans today.
Really?
Yeah. I remember seeing this documentary on YouTube of this area in rural Albania where there's like generations of young boys who haven't left their family's property because they're going to get killed in the blood feud if they do.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah, far out. I was thinking in my head, like, I'm pretty sure this happens in, like, Papua New Guinea, but I didn't want to, make a mistake there. But yeah, I mean, that's obviously it happens all around the world. But Nietzsche's point is that, like, he views civilization, right, as the taming of humanity. And so what happens is these, like, religious figures, historically, it is religious figures who are doing it, but today it's not. We begin to internalize this idea of debt. So if you do something for me, even though we live in a society where, like, I guess the threat of force is implicit, but because it's been there for so long, I begin to internalize this idea that I have to repay you. And I hear this voice in my head telling me that I have to do it. And if I don't do it, I'll feel guilty. So it's actually this internalization of this feeling that I should behave in a certain way. And Nietzsche calls this the guilty conscience, and right, it's turning inward, right? And you see a lot of this in Freud later on, because his whole point is like, well, historically, like, we would act outwardly to get our revenge, but in civilization we can no longer do this, right? So it gets internalized. He talks about so many of our things, so many of our moralities and our sentiments becoming internalized, and previously, we would exercise violence against other people. But now that we can't do that, it gets turned inwards, and these feelings of will to power get repressed, and they actually are violent inwardly. and we get these feelings of guilt, which he views as like psychologically very harmful. So it's like this inner violence that occurs because we can't express the violence outwardly. It's a very interesting idea.
Yeah, I've got the passage here, and it is super, super Freudian. I mean, I haven't read Freud myself, but you just kind of get acquainted with his ideas in a broad sense, and his idea of these psychological processes and the ways we act being informed in ways that we're not necessarily conscious of, and these happen due to your environment and your inability to do certain things, and it expresses itself in other ways. And I'll just read out Nietzsche's passage here from Genealogy of Morals, and we'll see how similar this sounds. All instincts that cannot be given external expression turn inwards. This is what I mean by the internalization of man. And with this we have the first appearance in man of what subsequently was called his soul. The whole inner world, at first so very minute, unfolded, acquiring dimension, depth, breadth, and height, when man's external outlet became obstructed. These formidable defences, used by the Commonwealth to protect itself against the old instincts of freedom, various forms of punishment being among the primary means of defence, made man, wild, free, untamed man, turn all those instincts against himself. Enmity, cruelty, the delight in persecution, in attack, destruction, pillage. The turning of all these instincts against their very owners is the origin of the bad conscience.
Yeah, so in that quote it talks about like the Commonwealth, right? And so this sort of inward internalization serves a purpose, right? Because he talks about for society to function, our actions need to be calculable, to use his own phrase. Like, they need to be predictable. Whereas in a state of nature, he's not a state of nature theorist, but just to give the example, like, I can lend you something, and there's nothing guaranteeing that you're going to ever give it back. Like, so society doesn't function if we can't, to a degree, predict one another's behavior. And so you get these like violent means of doing that, but over time, he refers to this as like social custom, and he says, with the help of the morality of custom and the social straitjacket of man was made truly calculable. So he views morality and customs as these straitjackets which constrain our behaviour and thus make us calculable to one another so that society can function. And then he calls this responsibility, and he says, this power over oneself has sunk into his lowest depth and has become instinct, the dominant instinct. This sovereign human being calls it his conscience. So this is where conscience comes from.
Yeah.
It's an internalization of these formerly outward power relations.
And I feel like it's worth noting as well is that he sees the life denying aspects of this as something bad. It's not a great inheritance, and it needs to be moved beyond. We need to move back to some sort of life affirming form. But he doesn't see the consequences of the sort of like the psychological consequences of this bad conscience, this slave morality, this guilt as being wholly bad. Because he says, like that passage I just read earlier, it's through this sort of thing that humans gain depth inwardly. Like in that first essay where I read out that passage about the good men having, they were acting purely through instinct. But when you don't have that ability and you have to look inward, you gain a broader inner life. You gain an inner world that wasn't there before.
Yeah.
And it's through this that we get so many great, achievements in thought, in art, and in culture. Those outward expressions were a result of that inward broadening, that inward interrogation, that inner depth that came about as a result of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's two things to say there. It would be simplistic to read Nietzsche as being like wholeheartedly against slave morality.
100%. Yeah.
He's much more complex than that. And it would, secondly, as a related point to that, would be a mistake to go, oh, he's against this, therefore he must want to go backwards. No. All these developments have served their purpose, but we need to go forward. We can't be like, oh, yeah, like people are so soft today, so let's just go back to like, when we were, quote, blonde beasts of prey, like prowling Europe. And, destroying the Celts or something. I don't know. Like, he doesn't want to go backwards. It's to go forwards, right? And so a misreading of Nietzsche would be to read this, would be to think that he wants to go backwards. But he says something really interesting that when humanity, this is a quote, when humanity was not yet ashamed of its cruelty, life on earth was more light-hearted than it is now, and that there are pessimists. The darkening of the heavens over man has always increased proportionately as man has grown ashamed of man. A little bit further on, I mean the disease softening and moralization by virtue of which the creature man finally learns to be ashamed of all his instincts. And he further says that man has bred for himself that upset stomach and coated tongue, through which not only have the joy and innocence of the animal become repulsive, but life itself has become unsavory. So what does he mean by this? In this softening, in this of us becoming ashamed of our instincts, on the one hand, that's good, because we're not killing each other all the time. But on the other hand, you find this sort of malaise. I mean, right back to our first episode, right? The malaise of modernity.
Hey.
You find this malaise in modern society in which people sort of think like, well, where is the meaning? Like, modern life is so boring. You go to school, you go to uni, you get a 9-to-5 job, and all your successes are measured in terms of like consumerism. Get a house, buy stuff to fill that house up with. There's no meaning to life, right? Life becomes really unsavory. And again, in Francis Fukuyama, he wrote The End of History. The actual full quote of that essay come book is The End of History and the Last Man. And the last man he's referring to Nietzsche. And actually the end of history, I mean, I have a lot of criticisms of Fukuyama, but you have to give him his due, because at the end of history, he says, it might be the case that when history ends, this will be incredibly boring because there's nothing for anyone to fight for anymore. And it will become so civilized, it'll be so dull. It's like life has become numb. It's become anesthetized. And that is what Nietzsche is identifying. This sort of like, through this taming of man, for all its positives, there's this side effect that like a lot of people feel that life just has no purpose. And that, I think, is why a lot of people like Nietzsche.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because he doesn't... He's a real, like, aggressive philosopher in this sense, where he says, no, it's right that you shouldn't feel satisfied by all of this. It's only natural that you should want to, exercise yourself upon the world, and that when you're constrained in such a way that you're, the bounds of your action upon the world is just to, get a nice job and get a house. Well, that's so circumscribed. That's so, yeah, like you said, that's so tamed. You're like a sort of a cow going through the pen of the factory farm. And, you can't walk beyond the fences that are along the way through this path.
Well, if you look at like the demographics of people who join like extremist organizations, a lot of people are surprised when they find that it's predominantly like middle class men and men who have actually like rich parents, good school, did well at uni, and then got like a white collar job, right? They're actually like, that's the demographic of a lot of people who join organizations, be it like ISIS or like far right wing organizations. And it's because I'm not defending it in any sense. It's obviously abhorrent, but like it's because for a lot of people, life just has absolutely no purpose, and so they're looking around for this like cause to die for, to give them life, to give their life some sort of meaning. And obviously, like that's a bad solution, but like the underlying malaise is a real problem.
And that's a great example, and to add on something that most people listening to this would think of as something noble, like a good cause that fits in with this sort of dynamic. Think of people who would volunteer to go fight for the Kurds in Syria.
Yeah, it's the same sort of thing. Yeah,
people who volunteer to fight in Ukraine on the Ukrainian side, or people who volunteer to go fight in like the Spanish Civil War. they're all expressions of this same sort of thing. You know, for Nietzsche, it's only natural that you should want to go exert force upon the world, that you should have this desire to seek discomfort, but discomfort in such a way that there's a genuine sense of something gained when you do so. There's a sense that you can gain something, you can gain glory, you can gain a sense of power. And not even like power necessarily over other people in the sense of subjugation, but you're affirming your own ability to act upon the world by doing these sorts of things. You know, you're saying like, you're giving a big middle finger to the world around you that says, oh, you have to go live this boring life. You're going, well, no, I'm going to go exercise my will upon the world, and I'm going to do it in a way that is violent, but in a way that really is an exercise of my will.
Yeah, I mean, to take like the organism analogy that Nietzsche and other philosophers around this time use, organisms like need sort of external stresses and tensions to actually grow and develop. I mean, again, like a really mundane example is like going to the gym. Like, why do you get stronger? Because you're actually like stressing your body, right? And modern society is such that like it's possible to go through your entire life without ever facing like any real major challenges and stresses and tensions. And as a result, we become like incredibly placid. And we're actually like weak. It's this absence of like struggle makes us weak.
And from that as well, is it any wonder why people are so, depressed and anxious nowadays? Nietzsche would say, no, you feel at your best when you're struggling against the world, when you're exercising your power through, and the only way you can really exercise your power is through conflict. You have to work through conflict. And you shouldn't shy away from it, because if you shy away from it, well, like we're talking here, we're talking in this essay about, guilt and bad conscience, and you can kind of extrapolate that to other negative feelings as well. Like, you're going to feel shit if you're not trying to exercise yourself upon the world in a free sense.
You need to push yourself, and you need to compete, and you need to, like, that's like what we're designed for. We have this innate will to power. And like, I guess jumping ahead a little bit to the third treatise, where he's talking about ascetic, not aesthetic, but ascetic, the idea of self-denial, right? Like a priest renouncing all the earthly pleasures and being celibate, for example. That's an example of asceticism. The reason he's against asceticism, because he sees it as like that their solution to these sort of like modern problems is further self-denial, and they're not actually addressing the root cause. And when I was reading this, why he doesn't like asceticism, it's sort of like, I'll give an example from popular culture, The Sopranos, fantastic TV show.
Very good.
What's fantastic about The Sopranos is underlying the show, well, it's built into the structure of the show, is mental health. And it's like in the 90s and early 2000s. And it really, you look at like, what's fascinating about that show is that the main character, Tony Soprano, is going to a psychiatrist. And at the one hand, like, his problems are external. Like, the stresses that he faces in his life are external. But throughout the show, and other characters in the show who also have mental health problems, what do the psychiatrists do to them? They medicate them. They try to numb them. And they also, even though the show portrays their problems as being externally driven, the solution of the psychiatrist is, look inwards. Like, we need to delve deeper into you, or take Prozac, take something else. It's this numbing, which might work superficially, but it's not actually addressing the problem.
Yeah. There's a good line from the first season of the show where Tony, the main character, is in a car with Christopher, another one of the characters, and Tony's just started seeing this psychiatrist, and they're New Jersey Italian mobsters, so mental health isn't so much a topic that you can speak freely about. And Tony floats this idea of like, well, what do you think about the idea of people taking antidepressants and stuff, because he just got prescribed antidepressants, and Christopher says something along the lines of, there's no chemical solution to a spiritual problem.
Yeah, very true. And that same scene, they're in the car, and what triggers Tony to say that is Christopher, like, he's sort of depressed in the first season, right? Because he's trying to find meaning and recognition from others, and he's feeling like he doesn't get it. And he says to Tony in the car, I don't know, Tone, it's like the ordinary regularness of life is too much for me. It's like the mundaneness of life is what's making him depressed, right? And you see that in the show, the mundaneness of life in the 90s when history supposedly ended and America was allegedly like hugely prosperous. Why is it that in this historical epoch, when things are supposedly the best they've ever been, what you get is this unfurling mental health crisis? Because there's this malaise. People just feel that life is completely pointless.
To go back to Nietzsche, quote, "Alas for this mad, melancholy beast, man. What wild fantasies are visited upon this beast? What perversity, paroxysms of hysteria, madness and bestiality of ideas spring forth immediately, if he is impeded in the slightest way from being the beast indeed."
Yeah.
So if you can't act yourself upon the world, well, you're going to act yourself inward and it's not going to feel good.
No, you're going to torture yourself. Fuck, I love The Sopranos.
Yeah, it's really good. Go watch The Sopranos, audience.
It's just such a great show. So many layers.
I feel like you segued really nicely into the third essay talking about aesthetic ideals. So should we go into that one?
Yeah, let's talk about the third treatise. What do aesthetic ideals mean? And he talks quite a lot in this treatise about how philosophers have always loved the idea of asceticism, always loved this idea of self-denial, and they've always had this trend of denying the reality of like the material world, the world of appearances, and they're trying to, through their denial, trying to find something greater. And it really reminds me of the first book of Plato's Republic, where Socrates is talking to someone, and they're talking about old age, and this older guy is like, I've never been happier, because when you're old, your sexual desires leave you. And I think the quote is like, I feel like this old master has left me. Like I'm no longer a slave to this cruel master, which is his sexual appetite, right? That's gone. So philosophers, in their will to truth, in their desire to like find out the truth about the world, have always had this obsession with a form of asceticism, this denying anything which might distract them from this search for truth. And look, I intuitively don't see anything wrong with that. I guess I would say there's virtue in moderation. You can take it too far. But Nietzsche is not too keen on asceticism. And I confess I don't really completely understand why. Because in a certain sense, here's a great quote. Like he's talking about the aesthetic ideal. And he goes, what does it mean when a philosopher pays homage to the aesthetic ideal? We get at least a first hint here. He wants to break free from a torture. So, like this torture of like the earthly pleasures, like you feel enslaved by them. And you have this whole history and philosophy of people trying to escape this. To me, aestheticism seems like an instance of what he's actually talking about when it's a will to power. But he doesn't like asceticism, and I don't really understand why.
Yeah, so I think he's a bit complex on asceticism because he would agree, like, this is an expression of your will to power. It's an expression of your will to power to block out the outside world and to look inward. But it's an expression in the sense that it's an incomplete expression of the will to power from how Nietzsche would conceive it in an ideal sense. So you're not really acting outwardly upon the world, you're acting inwardly. And he thinks that's admirable. I try to find the passage, but I'm sure that I'm going to find it 5 minutes after I say this. But he says somewhere, like, look, if you want to live by the ascetic ideal, you should go ahead and do that. You know, that's fine. If that's how you want to express your will to power, then, you know, go crazy with it. That's cool. But don't do it in such a way that you expect everybody else to do it as well. Don't do it in such a way that you make it a universal sort of precept of morality that other people should also expect themselves to close out the outside world, because that is life denying. He's all for life affirming things. If you feel affirmed by being able to act inwardly, block out the outside world, then you can do that, but don't block other people from doing that as well. I think that's the crux of his criticism of it.
Yeah, I guess why I didn't fully understand this treatise is because it's sort of like, maybe this is just how I interpret the word asceticism, but under that umbrella I would include people who deny eating bad food, for example, and are really like disciplined in like working out. To me, that's an example of will to power, because they're like pushing themselves, they're putting themselves under stress, and they're trying to become stronger. And earlier in the book, he says he's against this softening of our feelings. So that's why it confused me when he sort of was a little bit sus about asceticism, because I was like, well, isn't someone who does this exercising their will to power? And wouldn't you be against the other person who like people who claim that, like, this is obviously not many people say this, it's sort of like an online trope, but like people who say that working out is fascist.
Actually, I think there's a passage in Adorno where he says something vaguely to that effect, where it's both fascist and it's homoerotic to work out and be an alpha male. Yeah. Or like people who sort of like, I run into them all the time. Like, I can see it in their eyes. Like, they sort of cringe when I tell them that I like boxing. They're like, oh, but that's bad. Yeah.
You're hurting people. It's like, yeah, but they consent to it.
Yeah.
And I get hurt too. So when I think of asceticism,
right,
that's what I think about. So I was a little bit confused about why he was not completely on board with it.
Right, because the way I feel it is sort of like a denial of pleasure, of outward pleasure in a sense. You're stopping yourself from enjoying outside things. But he would also, he alludes to this briefly in the first essay, where he talks about the knightly aristocratic class, the values of that morality being around strength and power. And he mentioned something about how, well, you have to exercise, you have to have a physical vigor as part of this morality, so that you can exercise yourself upon the world. And he sees the asceticism as you might conceive, I don't know, like a Stoic or a Platonist, to have it, to be something that's apart from this. Like,
sure.
You're not focused on exercising yourself in a physical sense upon the world, or exercising a self-control that allows you, a physical self-control that allows you to have a greater capacity to act upon the world, which is sort of how we might conceive working out. He conceives of asceticism in the sense of close yourself off from the world. And
so he wouldn't object to how I'm interpreting asceticism.
No, he would say, if you want to work out, that's good and cool and you should do it.
Yeah, because I've just flicked to, I remember noting this down when I read it. For them, this is people who are happy, being active is of necessity included in happiness. All of this very much in opposition to happiness on the level of powerless, oppressed, those festering with poisonous and hostile feelings, in whom it essentially appears as narcotic, anesthetic, calm, peace, Sabbath, relaxation of mind and stretching of limbs, in short, passively, while the noble human being lives with himself in confidence and openness. So, yeah, this like being active and exercising and like just doing, like that, Nietzsche is very much in favor of that. So, yeah, I guess like the sort of Platonic, let's go and like live in a cave for 20 years, or sort of like the priest who, again, like the priest from season 1 of Sopranos is sort of portrayed as this, like, actually he's a really good example. I said that sort of sarcastically, but the more I think about it, like the priest in season 1 of Sopranos, he's ascetic because he's a Catholic priest, so he can't have sex. So he's engaged in this form of self-denial, and he's doing it allegedly in service of this like higher ideal. He's trying to become closer to God. But the show is really clever because it shows how he's actually like a bit of a worm-like character. He sort of inveigles his way into the Sopranos' home because he like has the hots for Carmela, but he can't just outwardly say it. So he has to do it in this kind of like slimy kind of way. And he really gets off on like eating food that women cook for him because he can't exercise his sexual appetite. So it literally like gets like sublimated or transfigured into this like food appetite. And Carmela like notices it and eventually calls it out. But like I guess that is an example of like your outward desires turning inwards and then getting manifested as something else. But he's like this kind of like, he kind of recoil in all the scenes he's in. He's a really like, I don't know.
He's a creepy, slimy sort of character.
He's a creepy, slimy sort of character, but that's probably an example of what Nietzsche's talking about.
Well, yeah, I think that's a phenomenal example. Actually, I'm just remembering now, there's in the second season of Sopranos, there's an episode where AJ becomes obsessed with Nietzsche. So
it's deliberate. Like, I'm not just making this shit up.
Yeah, like you get the sense that the Sopranos writers actually would have been fairly familiar with Nietzsche because a lot of these ideas echo very strongly in the show.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a piece to be written about like Sopranos and Nietzsche.
You should write it.
Maybe I need. Yeah, absolutely. I just need to sit down and write. That's the hard bit.
Now, true to form, how I said earlier that when we were talking about the ascetic ideal and Nietzsche approving of it in a sense, I said in 5 minutes I'm going to find the quote, and it's been 5 minutes and I found the quote.
Fantastic.
I'll read it out. I have the utmost respect for the ascetic ideal insofar as it is honourable, so long as it believes in itself and plays no pranks on us. But I have no liking for all these coquettish bugs who have an insatiate ambition to smell of the infinite until eventually the infinite smells of bugs. I have no liking for the pale imitators of life. I have no liking for the exhausted who swathe themselves in wisdom so as to appear objective. I have no liking for histrionic agitators costumed as heroes who wear the sorcerer's cap of ideals on their straw heads. I have no liking for the ambitious artists who would pose as the ascetic and the priest, but are merely nothing but pathetic buffoons. So that gives a good sense of the way in which he's really scathing and likes to bag out people. Mm-hmm. But I feel like that's getting at his sort of his qualification for how he would enjoy or approve of asceticism and how he would oppose it. So if your asceticism affirms your life, then that is good. If your asceticism is a means to deny life in yourself and others, then that's not good.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I get it now, and I'm with him. And I just want to mention, we said at the start about how like Nietzsche is, I guess, more readily taken up on the right. But I think that the way that that's done is just, surprise, surprise. Look, they don't know what they're talking about. They do it in a really in a way that betrays Nietzsche. And you said that this Nietzsche likes to provoke. He's a provocateur. Let's look at someone like Milo Yiannopoulos, right? Also, he sort of fancied himself as a provocateur, and a lot of right-wing figures enjoy triggering lefties. And their critique of the left, of a lot of these snowflakes, is that they're too soft, they're too easily offended. They have a slave morality, right? And I would agree with that critique. I think that they're right about that. But their disingenuousness lies in the fact that for Nietzsche, the solution is to go forward. Whereas for these people, I know you don't like this word, but they're reactionary because they look at this sort of effete, slave morality left, and they go, they call it out, and a lot of people agree with them, and then they do the bait and switch, and they're like, well, this is why we need to have a sort of 1950s morality, women's rights suck, minority rights. They go backwards, which is not what Nietzsche wants us to do. He wants us to go forwards, and so that's why I find these thinkers Milo Yiannopoulos is not a thinker, but Jordan Peterson, I find him a really disingenuous character because he reads allegedly Nietzsche and he talks about the loss of meaning, and he draws on all these themes, but he seems to me to not get the final point, which is the solution is not to go backwards. It's not to become Christians again. It's to go forwards, and they miss that, and they just get stuck down on the bagging everyone around them for being a soft pansy, which might be true. But then their solution is just all right, well, let's just go back to some earlier, Western, quote unquote, Christian morality, which like it just misses the point.
Yeah, 100%. Nietzsche would completely agree with that critique of the modern, let's say, alt-right or alt-right.
Yeah.
That's not a solution. They want to go back to the sort of thing that he is critiquing in his own time, and he would be disappointed in the fact that they haven't ventured to move forward.
Yeah, I mean, look at Marley and like he's a great example where he's literally like an atheist, and then in critiquing the left, he's gay, then he like allegedly like converted to Christianity and self-admitted himself to gay conversion therapy and like left his husband. Horrible. Like I genuinely feel sorry for the guy. Like obviously he's very unhappy, but he has this resentment. Like these feelings turned inwards and he hates himself and he has this self-loathing, and it's like, because you missed the point, man. You went backwards. That's not where you want to go.
Yeah, for sure. And there is one modern right-wing take of Nietzsche that I think is actually fairly interesting and does some sort of justice to him, which is Bronze Age mindset by Bronze Age pervert. But there is some very odious things in it because he is very right-wing and he's not afraid of putting that forward. But he also he got doxxed, and it turns out that he did a PhD, a comparative study of Nietzsche and Plato. So he does really know his stuff about Nietzsche. So there's at least one person out there on the right who I feel actually has some good authority to speak on Nietzsche, and he really hammers home this idea of life affirming and giving some people the capacity to act upon the world in a completely unconstrained way, which is very provocative and very frowned upon in our world. And he says some very odious shit as well. But as far as a right-wing reading of Nietzsche, I think that one is at least a very interesting and informed one.
Yeah, man. I want to read more Nietzsche.
Stay
tuned for more Nietzsche.
Yeah, we should do more Nietzsche.
I'm convinced of the. Look, at times I found it hard to get through. I was like, "What the fuck are you talking about?" But overall, like, there's some real gems.
Yeah, I have parts of this where like he splits each essay up into sections. And they're usually about like 1, 2, 3 pages. And I have some sections where I've literally underlined like every paragraph of it.
Yeah.
Like
I've done that too.
Honestly, like if I could, like I would just like read extended passages of this out for you, our beloved audience. But I don't know how much of a good pod that'd be. You might as well just listen to like an audiobook at that point.
Yeah, just listen to an audiobook of Nietzsche.
But yeah, we should do more Nietzsche. I think we already have some stuff queued up, but Birth of Tragedy would be another good one.
Yeah,
because his other works are like aphorisms, so it's it's not really like a unified argument throughout in the sense that this one on the Genealogy of Morals is. But The Birth of Tragedy, which is his first real book that he put out, is another one in the essay format with like a unified thing going throughout. So I feel like that would be a good one that we can tag on to.
Yeah, for sure. Sounds good. Yeah, I need to catch up with you and, read Beyond Good and Evil as well. So I have a slightly more solid grasp of these ideas. But yeah, I think that's a good place to finish up.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone. Please give suggestions. Please like, subscribe, give us a rating on whatever streaming service that you're listening to us on. We'll give you should we go through our upcoming program?
Yeah, so we should be able to smash out The Social Contract by Rousseau this week. Short book, easily written. So yeah, we'll do that. And then after that was Confessions by
Usher.
Yeah, Usher. Which is going to be an interesting contrast with this because like that's asceticism par excellence, right? He's really renouncing all the earthly pleasures there. And then we're going to be ambitious and we're going to do the Critique of Pure Reason. Yeah.
So we've both been talking about Kant a bit recently, and Kant is sort of the, like we say in modern thought, there's a God-shaped hole in everything. In a lot of philosophy, there's not necessarily a Kant-shaped hole, but it's all working around Kant's shadow, and we've got to confront it at some point. And we're going to do the big critique of pure reason, but because it's so big, and we don't want to make everyone wait
2 months.
2 months for us to read the book. The book is split up into smaller sections within what Kant titled them as different books within the book. So I feel like the best way to go about that is we'll do an episode for each book along the way as we're reading it.
Yep, absolutely. Lecturer put it well once. He goes, most philosophers today are moving within the conceptual space opened up by Kant. He's very, very key to read. So we will be, after we get through Rousseau and Augustine, then we'll be doing Critique of Pure Reason. And then from there, we're full-blown German idealists.
Let's do it. Stay tuned, folks.
Stay tuned. See ya.
Thanks.